Morning, it's April 7th, and this is To My Little Friends. Well, everyone wants to talk about tariffs, and most people don't really understand how they work and the leverage they can create. Well, Donald Trump has been talking about tariffs for over 40 years. He's pointed out over and over that other countries have taken advantage of the free trade policies of the United States. And as I said last Friday, there are things we do better here in the United States, and there are things that other countries do better than we do. One of the advantages that some countries, particularly Asia, have over the United States is cheap labor. Well, last Saturday, the Wall Street Journal had an article that talked about the iPhone and what tariffs would mean to someone and something that millions of Americans purchase and use. I'm going to use that article as a source for explaining how this all works. If you look at the iPhone 16 Pro, I'm still using the 14 Pro, the cost for a 256 gigabyte version is $1,100. The cost for the materials in the phone is about $500 to $550 for Apple. When you throw in the assembly, which is done in China, the cost only increases about $30 to $40, so it's right about $600 at max. Now we have to factor in what the tariffs would do to that cost. Apple's cost to make the phone and import it to the United States jumps to around $850. That would mean Apple would have to make a decision. Either they would eat those increased costs or pass them on by increasing the price of the phone. And this is where my comment about doing things better in one country comes in. If you were to move that assembly of the iPhone to the United States, that assembly cost would jump to near $300 due to higher labor costs, and in every single component. From the touchscreen display to the internal storage were built here in the U.S., the cost would skyrocket to where nobody could afford the phone. These prices are similar to all of the smartphones we use. We could all go back to using the old flip phones with no screens, the Motorola ones. Not something we'd want to do. But what about those things that we do better than other countries? The single most important one is agriculture. You won't find multi-thousand acre wheat farms in countries like France, Belgium, Germany, or Italy. They do have farms, but they're smaller and less efficient than the agribusiness of the United States. The same could be said for Japan and Germany and other Asian countries. But they've set up barriers, both with tariffs and quotas, that hinder U.S. exports of agriculture products to their countries. They're trying to protect their own domestic farmers who are less efficient than ours. Well, over the weekend, we've heard that some countries are already calling the White House about negotiating a new trade deal. Two of those mentioned are Vietnam and Germany. Right now, these two countries have significant trade surpluses. Vietnam has a surplus of about $123 billion, and Germany's surplus is $84 billion. Both of these nations are very dependent on selling their products in the United States. In 2023, Vietnam's exports to the United States reached $452 billion. Most of the products were low-end textiles, footwear, furniture, and parts and plastics. So in recent years, Vietnam has strengthened its high-tech manufacturing. With a population of only 98 million, Vietnam's GDP is heavily tied to exporting to the United States. In comparison, India, with a population of nearly 1.5 billion, exports only 84 billion products to the U.S., although its service exports and software are probably a lot larger. In the case of Vietnam, the United States could easily source the low-end Vietnamese products from other Asian countries. Vietnam, on the other hand, does not have another market for its goods like the United States. Over the weekend, Vietnam started reacting. They announced they're lowering auto tariffs from 45% and 64%, depending on the car, down to 30%, and they may have to go lower. Germany is also dependent on American consumers. In their case, they make high-end products like machine tools, luxury cars, and chemicals. It's not as easy for the United States to source those from another country, but there are options. Germany is aware of those other options, and so they're on the phone with the White House looking for ways to cooperate. Trump has some very specific goals with these tariffs. First, he's sending a clear signal that investing in America and creating jobs here is in the interest of corporations. A secondary effect of this goal is reducing the nation's vulnerability to supply chains, many of which start in China. The second goal is to change policies of our trading partners, some of which have nothing to do with trade. He wants more effort by them to curb illegal immigration in the United States and to stop the flow of drugs across their borders in the United States. Those three countries are Mexico, Canada, and China, where the drugs originate. The third, and most important, is to force other nations to reduce their own tariffs and non-tariff barriers to U.S. products. The United States is no longer interested in buying your friendship with economic aid and unfair trade agreements. Many of these nations use these tactics to protect their own workforce at the detriment of U.S. workers. What Trump is attempting is rare in modern politics. He's making the case that some short-term sacrifice will have to occur for longer-term gains. Most politicians would never attempt this tactic, and it's exactly why Trump has such a loyal following. He's banking on a couple of things happening. First and foremost, in his mind is the return of manufacturing jobs to the United States. As I mentioned earlier, there are some jobs that are not economically feasible, as in the case with iPhone assembly. But there are some that can and will return to avoid tariffs. General Motors and Ford have been producing cars in Mexico for a long time. They're using the close proximity to the United States, so transportation costs are minimal. They've been utilizing NAFTA. They've developed a skilled workforce in Mexico. All this adds up to lower production costs. But if they're now hit with a stiff tariff, they might have to consider relocating these production centers back to the U.S. I should point out that auto manufacturers like Audi, Volkswagen, Nissan, BMW, Honda, and Infiniti are also using Mexico as production centers. Looking at what they do with those cars produced in Mexico is interesting. BMW sends just about all the cars they produce in Mexico to the U.S. Ford has 3 plants in Mexico, and 90% of the 200,000 cars produced went to the U.S. GM imported about 750,000 cars from Canada and Mexico. Most were made in Mexico. Honda sends 80% of its Mexican production to the U.S. Nissan has 2 plants in Mexico and sends about 500,000 cars to the United States each and every year. Volkswagen ships about 350,000 cars from Mexico to the U.S. Toyota builds its Tacoma pickup in Mexico and sold more than 230,000 in the U.S. Start adding them up, and it's millions of cars being produced in Mexico and sold in the U.S. Car manufacturers will now have to make a hard decision. Either pay the tariff or move the production back to the U.S. If they pay the tariff, they either pass it on to the consumer, which would impact sales, or absorb the additional cost that eats into their profit margins. That's the dilemma they face, is exactly what Trump was hoping to create with these tariffs. This has been To My Liberal Friends. Thanks for listening.